Dr. Tom Crouch, who has some really fascinating things to say about aviation, but specifically he's going to talk about the beginnings and the origins of the museum. There's some interesting stories there about the design of the museum and the early exhibits plan. Dr. Crouch is Curator Emeritus for the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. And at the time of the museum's beginnings, he was working with the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus as their director of education. But he'll tell you a little bit more about how that led to being involved with our museum. So without any further introduction, I'd like to turn over the program to Dr. Crouch.
Thanks very much, Dante. And John's, Wes, for helping set this up, and all of you for coming this morning to listen to what I have to say. You're actually a much bigger crowd than I thought I'd have. That's nice. Nice of you to come out on a hot day to hear me talk about my memories of 50 years ago. And they're warm memories, great memories of working on the museum and of Wapakoneta and all the people who were involved in those days. It was actually the beginning of my career in museums, and a lot of museums have come and gone since then. But I always have a warm spot in my heart for the Armstrong Museum, where I actually began exhibit design work and so on and so forth. At the time when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, I was just 23. I had a bachelor's degree from Ohio University and a master's from Miami University. And I'd been teaching for 2 years, high school, but working on my master's degree, I'd gotten to know the people in Columbus at what was then the Ohio Historical Society. It's the Ohio History Connection now, but in my heart of hearts, it'll always be the Ohio Historical Society. But I'd worked with them while I was working on my master's doing research in Columbus. And so Daniel R. Porter just picked up the phone one day and called and asked if I'd like to step out of the classroom and plan education programs, history programs for the whole state on Ohio history, a subject I loved anyway. So I signed on with the Ohio Historical Society. And on the day Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, Nancy and I already had 2 kids. And I was one of those fathers, although a young father, who insisted that his kids get up to watch Neil land on the moon. And that was real exciting. I remember how disappointing, really, the TV images were, but the notion was really exciting. And it became even more exciting the next day or soon thereafter, within a day or so afterwards. Governor James Rhodes, governor of Ohio, announced that the state was going to build a Neil Armstrong Museum in Neil's hometown of Wapakoneta, Ohio. He figured it would cost about $1 million, and the state was going to provide half of that, and the local community would raise $500,000, the other half, and we'd build the museum with that. I had never done an exhibit. And as I said, I was running educational programs. But Dan, who knew my background, I had grown up at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and was one of those kids who loved airplanes. I was the world's champion airplane spotter. And even as a preteen, I would ride my bike from my home in Midway, Ohio, to where the Air Force Museum was in those days, in Fairborn, Ohio. And so Dan was aware of the fact that I was an airplane guy. And so at my tender age, Dan tapped me to do the exhibits for the Neil Armstrong Museum that we were going to build. This was really an incredibly busy time in the history of the Ohio Historical Society. We were building site museums. Oh gosh, there was a new one at Fort Meigs, a new one at Fort Ancient, a new one at Flint Ridge, a new Zanesville National Road Museum we were building, and Pottery Museum. And we were upgrading all of the other many sites that the Ohio Historical Society was responsible for. So it was really the most expansive period in the history of the Ohio Historical Society. They haven't had anything like that kind of activity since then. In fact, they've had to cut way back. Many of the museums that we built then as state museums are now operated mostly with local partners. In fact, Armstrong is one of those museums with a really heavy local partner group that's responsible for museum operations and that kind of thing. So really busy, and really busy for me too. In addition to working on the Armstrong Museum, I actually started my doctorate the next year at Ohio State in 1970. The Ohio Historical Society at that point was still on the campus at Ohio State. And we were about to move off the campus out to a corner of the state fairgrounds on the highway and build what's now the Ohio Historical Center. And in fact, having by that point done a lot of the work on the Armstrong Museum, Dan tapped me to do the history exhibits for the new state museum. And so that was going on while we were finishing up the Armstrong Museum. So for the Ohio Historical Society, and for me personally, it was just an extraordinary, rich and exciting and really, really incredibly busy period. Thinking about the exhibits that were going to go into the museum, when Governor Rhodes announced that we were going to build the Armstrong Museum, he had said that it was going to be dedicated to Neil and to all Ohioans who have attempted to defy gravity. And so thinking about that, I really intended to create a museum that would be built around Neil that would say something about the early history, the history in general of flight in Ohio, which the state has of all the American states, certainly Ohio has the richest history of aviation when you stop and think about it. It begins with Wilbur Orville Wright and the invention of the airplane, comes forward through companies like Aranca in Cincinnati and Waco in Troy, and manufacturers like Hartzell Propellers as well. The history of the airship is rooted in Ohio, in Akron, of course, and other towns as well. The National Air Show, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, as it grew from Old McCook Field to Wright-Patterson by the end of World War II. So you just can't find another state that has that rich an aviation heritage. And so I thought what we would do would be to put in the first half of the museum that would connect with that, lead to Neil, and go on through the history of the space age from there. So started with research. One of the first things I did, thinking about the history of aviation in the state, I did a lot of research, and I wrote a little book called The Giant Leap, Ohio Aviation personalities and events in Ohio aviation history. And Neil actually was kind enough to write the foreword for that, my first little book. And so with that kind of a background, the notion was to reach out and think about where we would get exhibits to fill the museum, because the Ohio Historical Society had almost nothing at that point that related to the history of flight technology. So I began scouring places, beginning with the Air Force Museum. Again, I had known Royal Fry, who was then the director of research at the Air Force Museum, but actually the brains of the outfit. And they had moved by that point from the old Air Force Museum in Fairborn to the new building out on Wright Field. And so I would spend time with Royal, thinking about what kinds of things they might have that we could borrow. But the big thing was the Smithsonian, of course. At that time, the Smithsonian had an agreement with NASA so that the Smithsonian would get first dibs on all space objects that NASA produced or contracted for. We'd get the first choice. So, of course, the Smithsonian had gotten all of the spacecraft, all of the spacesuits, and that kind of thing. So I started making trips to Washington. First one was with Dan, and after that by myself. And it was a lot of fun and a really rich collecting experience. Mike Collins, who of course had flown to the moon with Neil, was the director of the National Air and Space Museum at that point. So I kind of had an inside edge, but I got to know people in the aeronautics department whom I'd worked with for the next half century, and especially people in the old astronautics department. Fred Durant, who himself was a genuine space pioneer. Lou Purnell, who actually, when I got to the Smithsonian, taught me how to be a curator. Lou had been a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was almost ace fighter pilot. And at the time, in 1969, 1970, Lou was in charge of spacesuits for the National Air and Space Museum. And I met all of the others. Those early trips were tough. My wife grew up at the Boy Scout camp where I had been a counselor. And we were out there one day in 1969 visiting Nancy's mom and dad with our kids. And it was late in the summer. The scouts were all gone, but the swimming pool was still open. And I had taught swimming in that pool. So my father-in-law said one day, "Why don't you, Tom, take my bike right up to the pool and swim as long as you want?" So I went up, and rather than diving into the pool, I jumped in, and it was a little too shallow. I broke my foot, and the doctor put it not in a foot cast, but a whole leg cast. So I had learned to drive a car with my left foot and that kind of thing. And those early trips to Washington were made with me on crutches. But by that point, I could really zip around pretty quick. So that wasn't that much of a hassle. As I said, we were still on the campus. The OHS was when this started. And I would go zipping across campus on my crutches to classes. That first year, 1970, that I was working on my doctorate. So there I was, skipping around Washington on my crutches. But it was a real treasure trove for us, the Smithsonian was. I wasn't sure how generous they were going to be with this state museum that we were building in Ohio. But they were, in fact, really generous. The Gemini 8 capsule that you see, not capsule. Mike Collins always lambasted me for calling them capsules. They are spacecraft, Tom, he would say. But the Gemini 8 spacecraft that is still in the museum, Neil's Gemini suit, and a lot of the other smaller things too. I think John got Neil's backup Apollo suit later on, but a lot of what you see now that relates to Neil and the Apollo program, we got at the time generously from the Smithsonian. So that populated that, along with things that we got from Neil Armstrong and Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong, his parents, took care of a lot of that part of the museum. And we had other things too. That first year, someone, and I forget who, discovered that the airplane Neil had learned to fly, a little Aranca Champ, was still in the air. It was owned by a pilot up in Massachusetts. And so one of the things that the Ohio Historical Society, bought for the museum was that Aranca Champ. And we got the bicycle at about the same time. I forget where, maybe from Neil's parents. I forget. So that part of the museum was falling together really nicely. And it was also true that we were fortunate enough to have lots of people just passing things to us for the museum over the transom, as it were. Someplace there's a picture of me accepting portrait of Neil in his spacesuit. Not Norman Rockwell, but a nice one. And we would get things like that really frequently. And not just portraits, but all sorts of what you might regard as space age folk art, little statues and things that people on their own had created to commemorate this great moment in human history, and they were offering us that kind of thing. We got lots of things, as I've said, from Neil and his parents too. The little gold limb that was stolen a while back came in from Neil at that point. And I remember really nice gifts that he gave us that he had received during the world tour that Mike and Neil and Buzz made after the Apollo 11 flight. So he had that kind of thing coming in. I remember, I wish I could remember his name. He was a modeler, plastic modeler, and he had created a whole air force really of really nice, fairly well done plastic models that he donated.
It was George
I'm sorry,
McClintock.
John?
George McClintock.
That's it, George McClintock.
Yep.
Great guy. I still, when I finally left Columbus for Washington to go to work for the Smithsonian in 1974, I remember George gave me a model of a P-26 between the wars Army open cockpit monoplane fighter. And he painted it up in bowling field colors, Washington, DC's Air Force Base colors. And I still have it on my my emeritus desk at the 901 D Street, where the offices of the National Air and Space Museum are these days, with a little plaque with George's name on it. And the last time I was in the Armstrong Museum, I noticed some of George's models were still on display, which is really nice. So we were getting those kinds of things just great gifts, as well as the space stuff from the Smithsonian and other things as well. I not only got to know the people on the space side, but on the aeronautical side as well. And we got some great Ohio objects. A. Roy Nabenshoe, who had run the flying team for the Wright brothers after 1910. Back in 1906, Roy had actually, he was from Toledo, had actually been flying a one-man airship, just a simple beam frame with a motorcycle engine and a prop at the front and a rudder at the back and a big homemade gas bag overhead. And he was one of those who would go chugging through the sky over Ohio cities, giving air shows and that kind of thing in the early years of the 20th century. And I remember, again, I can't remember his last name, Larry, just a great guy who was one of our artisans in the shop at the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus. He and I restored that airship frame with the assistance of a guy named Stanley Vaughn, who had run the North American operation in Columbus during World War II, and when they were building P-51s and so on. And he was still around. He was in his pushing his 90s, but Stan came down and helped us restore this old airship that his friend Roy Nabenshoe had flown in the very beginning of the 20th century. And we also got parts of the skin of a Wright Model G, a Wright airboat that had been flown by another Ohioan, a guy named Ernie Hall, who, when I knew Ernie in the very late 60s, early 70s, again, he was pushing 90 and still running a little airport in central Ohio. The FAA made him take a flight physical like every 4 months, but Ernie was still teaching, and he had flown this airboat. So we got that, and just pieces and patches of the skin. But the folks in Columbus were able to rig it up so that it at least looked like part of an airplane. And working with Art Klipfel, Freitag and Freitag had the architectural firm hired to do the Armstrong Museum, had hired a local Wapakoneta native. He wasn't local anymore, but he'd been born in Wapakoneta, named Art Klipfel. And they hired Art to really do the conceptual design of the museum itself, but to work on the exhibits as well. So effectively, Art and his crew were the designers of the exhibits at the Armstrong Museum. I did the scripting and collected the objects and all of that. So between us, we did those first generation exhibits. And what you see today at the Armstrong Museum, the first part, I don't know, John, 20 years ago?
Yes.
John and the Ohio Historical Society decided they wanted to redo some of the exhibits. So they rebuilt the front part of the museum as you see it today, leading through the early history of rocketry and the space age and so on. The central part of the museum, the Neil Armstrong part, is pretty much the same. I mean, the Aranca is still hanging in the well, as we put it there, before the opening in 1972, and the bike's still on the wall. That was Art Klipfel's idea, and it was really genius as a way to show even a little airplane in a space as restricted as the Armstrong Museum would have been tough. And Art came up with that really unique and really nice way to show Neil's first airplane. And as you get to the point where you're walking up toward the Gemini 8 and so on and so forth, we had also installed some interactives, which were kind of interesting. We had something called an orbit table that was really an air puck table, essentially, but it would teach the kids something about the way in which the laws of motion work and so on, as you flipped pucks, basically, across the surface of the table and watch what happened. And we had a gravity well as well that kind of demonstrated, your coin slipping down into the black hole. So we had some things like that were really fairly innovative for American museums at that point. So that was kind of neat. And as you walked past the space area, you turned the corner and went through what was then an area devoted to the command center. These days, Dante has all kinds of space stuff up there, post-Apollo and so on and so forth. But when you were through that, you went through what we call, and still they call, the Infinity Box, the Infinity Room, which was one of Art Klipfeld's really good ideas. We only had so many exhibits, objects for this museum. So Art wanted to give people some sense of sort of the infinity of space. And that was not at all a bad way to do it. And you went from there, of course, as you knew now, into what they still call the Astro Theater. And I know John in West in later years always wanted to do a planetarium in there, and that we could never afford to do it. So they do now what we did then, which is to show mostly NASA films relating to Apollo 11 and other space programs in there. And then you walked out, and outside the Astro Theater is where we had a lot of what I'm calling space folk art, neat things that people had donated to sort of commemorate and honor Neil and the Apollo program, the space program, and so on and so forth. So that's basically what the museum was like in those days. And again, a good part of it is still there. The front part's different, but a good part of it is still there. As I said, those years from 1969 to 1972 were just incredibly busy for the society and for me as well, because by 1972 I was finishing up the history exhibits for the Ohio History Center, and that was a huge project. But as we got close to finishing the museum, Art's work and Freitag and Peterson Construction and so on, we were given a lot of thought to, or someone was above my pay grade, as to how we were going to open the place. And it was really chancy at that point. I'm sure John will remember looking at Lima newspaper stories in that period in the spring of 1972. They were all saying, it's really uncertain how they're going to open the museum. It's going to be low key and all of that kind of thing. Within a few days, literally, before the opening, we received word that we weren't even sure that Neil was going to show up. Neil Armstrong's attitude toward the museum had always been, he's a very modest guy. He was a very modest guy. And so I wasn't even sure Neil was going to be there for the opening. And all of a sudden we got word, and I can only assume that Dan and Governor Rhodes were pulling strings like crazy between Columbus and the White House. We received word that, in fact, 2 days before the opening date, that Tricia Nixon was going to be there, Neil was going to be there, and Tricia Nixon was going to bring a moon rock with her. So those were a couple of really exciting days. As we got closer to opening the museum, I mean, for most of the period, I was living in Columbus, and I would drive up to Wapak to meet with Art and the crew, or when they were hanging something, I'd drive up from Columbus. And it's a long drive from Columbus, I remember. But as we got close to the opening, I was actually living in what was then the Holiday Inn next door. They had built it assuming that when the museum open the museum and they will come. And of course they did. But fortunately, it was there to provide us with a place to sleep right next door to the museum. So the big day came. It was, as I remember, I asked Dante and John how hot it was there today. It was hotter then than it is there today. I remember Neil's comment was that when they landed on the moon, the temperature was some incredibly hot thing in the sun. And he said it looked as though Wapak was well on its way to beating that record on July 20th, 1972. But it was just an extraordinary day. My memories, when John first and Dante first asked me to do this, I thought, well, your memories are, they're not real sharp. In part, it's because of everything going on at once. And so much was going on that I didn't know about related to fundraising and the actual construction of the building and so on and so forth. But in fact, as I started to think about it, John sent me a picture I had completely forgotten about of myself and Dan Porter standing behind Tricia Nixon and Neil. And I mean, there are moments like that you just never forget. One thing I wanted to talk about was Dan Porter, who was, as I've said, the director of the Ohio Historical Society at that point. Of all the people I've worked for over the years, and I mean, that included Mike Collins, for heaven's sakes, and lots of other famous aerospace figures. Dan Porter may just have been my favorite boss. He was an extraordinary guy, just a bundle of energy. I am something of an introvert. People who know me will tell you. And I think that's typical of an historian, somebody who lives part of his time in the archives and part of his time sitting at a desk writing. But Dan was just the opposite. He was this incredible ball of energy. When Dan had come to the Ohio Historical Society, the place which had been founded in the 19th century, and it had a string of really interesting directors, famous archaeologists like W.C. Mills and Henry Clyde Chatrone. But the place when Dan arrived was being run by a guy named Erwin Zepp, who was getting on in years and had a tough time letting go of the reins. And Dan once told me that he'd spent his whole first year at OHS doing nothing but reading back issues of the Ohio Farmer, which was a famous agricultural news, 19th century Ohio newspaper, and it gave him a sense of what the state was like, what the state had been like. And so when I went to work for Dan in 1969, I didn't know anybody who was as well grounded in the history of the state as Dan Porter was. Dan was not an Ohioan, he was from Massachusetts. And the Ohio Historical Society was by no means his last post. He wound up running the New York State Historical Society, Association rather, in Cooperstown, New York. And the last time I saw Dan before he died, in fact, was at Cooperstown. I had taken a group of Smithsonian curators who were working on an exhibit on 19th century America up to the Farmers Museum and the New York State Historical Association, which Dan was running, and to give them a look at what their exhibition process was like. But it was great seeing Dan again. He was an extraordinary leader, and he had this wonderful sense of humor. I was going to read you part of the obituary that Dan had written for himself, which is just a hoot. But I forgot to dig it out before the camera went on. So you'll have to take my word for the fact that he had a great sense of humor. And again, I don't know whether the people in Columbus would agree with me or not, probably not. But those years under Dan Porter really were the golden age of the Ohio Historical Society. Again, with all of those museum projects underway. And the Armstrong Museum sort of the jewel in the crown for that period. Dan once said, and it was true because I was involved in some of the other little museums, no other museum that the Ohio Historical Society developed had the kind of public enthusiasm, local support, and just general enthusiasm to match that of the Neil Armstrong Air and Space Museum. And we had other help, of course. Out in front of the museum today, there's not only the Gates Learjet that you're going to cut the string on today, but the F-5D Skyhawk that Neil flew during the dinosaur program at Edwards Air Force Base, or Dryden Space Flight Center as it was then. And during the X-15 program too, they used it as an X-15 chase plane and that kind of thing. So that was a gift from NASA fairly early on. They held it for Royal Fry, held it for us at the Air Force Museum until we were ready for it in Wapak. So extraordinary memories, really, of just an extraordinary time in my life and in the life of the Ohio Historical Society. And as I said at the outset, when I look at it now, I mean, in the years since then, as I said, I did the exhibits for the Ohio Historical Center, the history exhibits. Mike Collins invited me to go to Washington, so I did the exhibits for the National Air and Space Museum when we opened it in 1976. The Stephen F. Varhazy Museum at Dulles Airport, which is our NASA kind of extension where all the big airplanes are and so on. And I worked on other airplanes as well, other museums as well. The Red Barn out in Seattle, which was the original core for the Great Museum of Flight that's in Seattle now. But after all that experience, it's looking back at the Armstrong Museum, as I said, that I still have a warm place in my heart for that place and the young kid and the other relatively young people who put it together and had a lot of fun doing it and a lot of satisfaction. So there you go. Are there any questions? Or John, what do you want to say? John.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story I bet you've not heard of before.
Okay.
You talked about the bicycle on the wall.
Yep.
So I have a story to tell about that. On the early days when the museum was open, it wasn't unusual for Neil's mother, Viola, to come out and walk through as I'd be touring school groups and so forth and so on. And happened one day she comes out and she wanted to know, she always asked, is it okay if I walk along? And she would walk along with me and fill in here and there. And I was so excited the fact that I have Viola with me when we would walk through the museum. So we're around the corner and she said, well, there, I see you finally got the bicycle up on the wall. I said, yeah. She said, you know, that is just like the one that Neil had. And my mouth dropped open. And she said, yeah. I said, well, that's not his. She said, no. She said, we sold that because we didn't have room for it anymore or something like that. And she said, we went to White's bicycle shop here in Wapak. If anybody's from Wapak knows it's White's bicycle shop. And she said, we bought one just like it. So we had to change the sign out there. That really wasn't Neil's bike, but one just like the bike that he rode back and forth to the airport. So that's one of my stories I bet you never heard of before.
Nope. I do have really warm memories of both Viola and Steve Armstrong, though, who were always there and always enthusiastic and helpful and so on.
Dr. Crouch, this is Susan. I wanted to ask about the outside design and whose idea it was the unique moon.
I think Art Klipfels. They Freitag and Freitag had hired Art. Had won a major architectural prize. He was he was a local boy, but a Yale graduate in architecture and sort of a rising star. And I've always thought, you're right, the unique design of that museum seen from the outside. I mean, on the inside, it gave us fits from time to time.
Still does.
But from the outside, it's genius. It's a brilliant design.
It is.
Just couldn't be better.
You can see it from behind. Yeah. It's unique. Very unique. Thank you.
Tom, I had a question. You touched on, the Gemini spacecraft from the Smithsonian, but if I recall, that was on display in St. Louis beforehand, and the folks in St. Louis were kind of surprised, right?
They were. There were some things, John, I wasn't privy to. I was worried about what was going to go in there and what we were going to say about it. But whose arm they twisted. Jim Rhodes, Governor Rhodes, was really an extraordinary guy. He had a lot of pull in various places in Washington, and I have no doubt that it was thanks to Jim Rhodes that it's there. It's still, of course, on loan from the National Air and Space Museum, but they're never going to recall it. It's part of the fabric of the Neil Armstrong Museum, and as you know, you had to renew it periodically. So,
anyone else have any questions?
Well, I have one for you, Dante.
Oh.
Do you still have that moon rock that Mrs. Nixon brought here?
Actually, John might be able to answer that. Is our moon rock the original one, or we got a different one from
No,
Johnson?
yeah, the first few years, we would only get the moon rock through the summer, and we would have to transport it back and forth. And a couple times, I was the lucky one who got to go on the airplane and try to explain to security about this little box that was handcuffed to my wrist when I was back and forth to back to Houston. where they stored the moon rocks. So over the years, I'd say we probably had 5, 6, 7 maybe different moon rocks. And then eventually NASA kind of eased back with it, and we were able to keep, lucky enough to have an Apollo 11, because we've got a 17, I think, and a 16 once. So, and the first one was very small. It was a little bubble under glass, I think, wasn't it, Tom?
Yeah, it was.
It was small. And then later we got what we have now, which is a really nice display from Apollo 11.
Do you know about what time that was installed? How long you've had this particular sample?
We've had that one for probably at least 20 years.
20 years.
Would be my guess.
Yeah, no, so if you haven't seen it, it's a nice, because it's a nice chunk. It's displayed in, like a gas atmosphere. It's not in lucite. Some moon rocks are, and according to the geological transcript from the mission, the sample, the parent sample, was actually collected by Neil Armstrong himself too.
Wow.
So, which is great.
I have a question.
All right.
Do you know if we were, or which museum was the first true air and space museum, or were we also the first museum dedicated to the legacy of an astronaut? Because now we have like Tom Stafford Air and Space Museum, other museums dedicated to astronauts, but were we the first true air and space museum?
Certainly not the first true air and space museum, but I can't think of an exhibit or a museum devoted to an astronaut earlier than ours, earlier than the Neil Armstrong Museum.
Thinking of other ways to promote the site.
Yeah, I'm the marketer.
Well, if there are no other questions, Tom, thank you for joining us virtually. I'm glad that this could work out. I guess one of the silver linings of COVID is we're also adept at doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So Tom will be joining us again in here, also virtual. Yeah, obviously. At 3:30 when we're having a panel on the construction of the museum. And we'll be joined by Dan Freitag of Freitag and Associates and John Zwez, and I'll be moderating. And then, but in the meantime, we have other stuff going on today. 1:30 will be the Learjet ribbon cutting, and followed afterwards will be the museum rededication. And laser shows going on in the Astro Theater today as a special presentation. And yeah, we have a special laser show just for today, Tom. It's really
Great.
bringing back the 70s, I guess. But
Wow.
Dante, I have a question.
Yeah.
The Longhorn that you're unveiling today, is that the first one?
That's 28001. So that was the first.
I've flown in that one. In fact, at one point, they were celebrating. Octave Chanute was an aviation pioneer who knew the Wright brothers and so on. And because he was a railroad builder, people out in Kansas actually named their town after him, Chanute, assuming that if they did that, he'd send the railroad through their town, which he did. And they were doing a U.S. postage stamp devoted to Chanute. This is back in the late 70s, early 80s. And so they invited me to come out representing the Smithsonian. And they invited my old mentor, Marvin Wilkes McFarland, who was the head of science and technology at the Library of Congress, and the guy who had done the genius job of putting together the papers of Wilbur and Orville Wright in print. So Mac and I flew out to Wichita, and son of a gun, Harry Combs, who ran Gates Learjet, was waiting for us there. And he flew us down to Chanute in that airplane, in the first Longhorn. And of course, it was famous to everybody then because Neil had played an important role in the design of the airplane. People tend to think of Neil Armstrong as the great pilot, great astronaut, which he was, of course. But if you'd ask Neil what he was fundamentally, he usually said he was a nose to the grindstone, pocket protector wearing engineer. And it's I think it's the definition that Neil probably would have chosen for himself. Not pilot, not astronaut, but engineer. And so his work on that airplane was really important, and it was really neat to fly in it. And of course, Harry told us of Neil's involvement and so on. Harry and Neil became friends. Harry knew almost nothing about the Wright brothers, and he and Neil were on a fishing trip up in the Sierras at one point, and they started talking, and Neil started talking about Wilbur and Orville Wright. Neil Armstrong, as those of you who knew him or paid attention to him probably knew, just thought that Wilbur and Orville Wright, their story was just the greatest story ever told. And he was stunned that Harry Combs, this great manufacturer of airplanes, knew nothing about them. So when they got back from their fishing trip, Neil actually sent Harry a copy of the 2-volume Papers of Wilbur and Orville Wright that Mac McFarland had edited. And that so inspired Harry Combs that Harry wound up writing his own book about the Wright brothers, and was heavily involved in the centennial of flight in 2003 and so on. But it's just a mark of how fond Neil was of the story of Wilbur and Orville Wright. When we were planning 2003, the Congress created a commission, and the commission had an advisory board, and President Clinton named me as chairman of the advisory board, and there were like 18 people on it, and there were some pretty well-known people. Kurt Russell, the movie star, was on it, but at the end, only 17 people had been named. Some of them were named by the White House, some by congressmen from Ohio and North Carolina, some by senators from Ohio and North Carolina. But at the end, we only had 17 members. And I called Neil and I said, I know how you feel about this story. One person remains to be named to the advisory board. If I could work it, would you accept it? And he said, sure. You know how I feel about Wilbur and Orville? And I said, well, come December 17th, 2003, somebody's going to have to go on Today and Good Morning America, and you know who they're going to want that to be. And of course, Neil hated that kind of thing. But he said, yeah, I understand that. If they ask me about landing on the moon, Tom, I'll ignore the question. I'll talk about the Wright brothers and the commission and what we're doing and all that stuff. Well, the guy who got to appoint that 18th person was a really conservative senator from North Carolina. And I called his administrative assistant one day and I said, I know your guy has one more appointment to make. And I know you would like a North Carolinian, but would he be willing to consider somebody really special? Would he consider naming Ohio and Neil Armstrong to the advisory committee? And the senator said, of course. All he asked was that next time Neil was in town, I'd take him up to the Senate office and so I could shake hands with him. And that's how Neil got on the advisory board. But when he was there, he did exactly what was needed. He was Neil Armstrong. Everybody wanted to meet him. Everybody wanted to talk to him. But as he had promised, when they asked him about the moon, he would just go from that question to answering a question about the Wright brothers, the centennial, and so on. It was really neat. And it was also really Neil that played into his affection for the Wright brothers. I remember he was interviewed the day the museum opened in 1972. And one of the things he said was that they'd given him a preview tour of the museum. I do not remember doing that. So I don't know who did it. Maybe it was me and I've forgotten, but I don't think I would have forgotten that. Anyway, what he said was, yeah, I really like a museum like this that focuses on the history of flight in the state that I came from. I think that's a really important story to tell, and I think they did a great job. And that made my day, in fact.
That's great. Well, Tom, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for coming here this morning for the
Thanks indeed.
many events today. And Tom will.
Bye all.
And Tom, we'll see you again later this afternoon. You'll phone in 3:15 so we make sure everything's working for 3:30.
You got it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot again.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Bye, John. Bye all.